This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Well, welcome to the second autumn term seminar of the Socialist History seminar here at the Institute of Historical Research. I don't think I've got anything terribly exciting to say, as usual. But just a reminder that there's lots of stuff on our website, details of which are on the newsletter londonasocialhistorians.blogspot.co.uk. One of these events, in particular, I think there's a historical materialism conference coming up in a few weeks' time, which will have, I'm sure, lots of interesting material. I haven't quite seen the final programme for that, but we'll have that on the website when it appears. And we still have several more seminars this term, as well as an interesting programme next term, which we'll publicise in due course. But tonight we've got John Newsinger, who has spoken here on one or two occasions before, but not about this subject, I don't think. And as you can see here, he's going to speak on a new edition of his book on British Counter Insurgency, about which I think it'd be fair to say John is something of an expert. You've certainly taught the subject in the past. So without further muttering from me, over to you, John.
Okay. The first edition of the book came out in 2002, and I think it's fair to say when it came out, the critical stance that the book adopted was very much a minority view. There'd been critical books, critical approaches before. David Edgerton had written a notable book about the Mau Mau, which is often forgotten. Malcolm Caldwell had done work on the Malayan emergency, and there are other people who I'm sure I've forgotten. But I suppose mine was the first to pull together a general critique of the idea that the British Army had some sort of expert skill in counterinsurgency, that whereas the French had been miserable failures in Indochina and Algeria, the Americans had been miserable failures in Vietnam, the Russians had failed in Afghanistan, the British military actually knew how to defeat counterinsurgency and had some expert knowledge, expert skill. I think one ironic, I think, reference was that it was in the DNA of the British Army being able to fight this sort of war. And I think it's fair to say that when the book came out, it was pretty much marginalised. It didn't have too much impact. And I think it's because it was cutting against, at least I like to think it was cutting against what was the dominant discourse. Today, I think it's fair to say that the academic consensus is that in fact the British Army's expertise was exaggerated. The various qualities that were identified as being peculiar to the British, minimum force, the hearts and minds approach, that these in fact were wildly exaggerated. And that, far from it being a tale of success, it was a much more mixed story, and where there had been successes, these were not so much due to British expertise as to the weakness of the opponents that the British faced. I think this has become much more the accepted view, which I'll go into a bit more. What I think is important, though, is that it wasn't just that research revealed more and more and more. I think what was also important was that the context changed. What you had was a situation where Britain's colonial wars after 1945 had by and large been part of a strategic retreat. However reluctant, nevertheless they were part of a strategic retreat. But in the first decade of the 21st century, what you had was, I would say, what you had was the British government actually handing over to the Americans the strategic decision making, that British troops were going to be fighting where the Americans wanted them to fight, and they found themselves fighting wars of aggression rather than being engaged in a strategic defeat. And these conflicts were absolutely disastrous for reasons that we'll consider. And it's the context of defeat, which I don't think the British general public has actually grasped the scale of, but it's the context of defeat in Iraq and Afghanistan that really enabled the more critical approach to gain purchase and to become the dominant view. Now, there are people who disagree with this. I think they are now the marginal people, though, and there's a book which, if you're interested in following up, by a bloke called Aaron Edwards, who is making a heroic stand, if you like, to defend British expertise, which I think came out last year. But he is still arguing that Britain has a very specialist expert knowledge of small wars, of counterinsurgencies. So it's quite interesting to have a look at his book, which is challenging what is now the consensus. Now, what I want to do is look at two particular wars in a little bit of detail, Malaya and Kenya, say a little bit about Northern Ireland, and then look at Iraq and Afghanistan, and end with what I hope will be some controversial suggestions about the way we are proceeding, the way things are going in the future, the way things are likely to be going in the future. But Malaya is a particular interest because this is a conflict where the British actually defeated communist insurgents, that they found the way to counter what for a time seemed to be an irresistible way of waging war. The British defeated communist insurgents, and people like Robert Thompson, Richard Clutterbuck. Clutterbuck tends to be forgotten, but once upon a time, he was turning out, I think, a book every year, every 18 months, was Richard Clutterbuck. And a couple of them, I think a lot of them were, just churned out, but a couple of them I think were really good. One of his Riot and Revolution, I think it was, in Singapore and Malaya, I think it was an absolutely superb book myself. These people were the people you turned to if you wanted to read up on these issues. In fact, I think it's fair to say that the consensus now is that the Malayan communists were a weak opponent, and that the British were able to defeat them, not so much through any expert skill, but because of the weakness that the communists exhibited. They were poorly armed, they were confined in terms of their support to the ethnic Chinese in Malaya, who were a minority of the population. They tried to break out of that ghetto, if you like, but they weren't successful. Not only that, but they waged a Maoist rural guerrilla war when over 40% of the Chinese population were actually urbanised, and they never tried to carry the conflict into the towns, which puzzled a lot of British people at the time, because they come from Palestine, where the Zionists had waged a very successful urban campaign. And of course they had no Ho Chi Minh Trail. Their weapons were what they'd kept from the Second World War, either captured from the Japanese or supplied by the British, or what they captured off the British. This was their arms. And in these circumstances, they were really up against it. They were poorly armed, they weren't well trained, many of them. Were people who went from the towns into the jungle. They weren't people who were used to living in the jungle. They went from the towns into the jungle. For them, it was a learning experience of how to fight in the jungle rather than something that, that they were already familiar with. So it was a weak enemy. It was a small war, and the British, first of all, made all sorts of mistakes. While they were in the process of getting to grips with the insurgency. But what they did was they brought in, I would argue, overwhelming forces to confront the communists, who never put more than 8,000 guerrillas into the field, or into the jungle would be more appropriate. They brought in a very large number of troops, police and home guard were mobilised against this threat. they used, I think it's fair to say, minimum force. In fact, now it'd be much more, the phrase to use is as much force as was necessary, has become much more the term that is used. You know, they used as much force as was necessary, and I think it's fair to say they were as brutal as the circumstances seemed to require. I'll say a bit more about the sort of sociology of military excess, which is not a subject that is widely studied. But perhaps it should be. But all war is a brutal, bloody affair, and soldiers commit what are described as excesses, because that is the nature of war, and that is the nature of young men at war. And I would say all armies do this, but all armies do it differently. It's not to say that they're all the same. All armies do it to some extent, but some armies do it to a considerably greater extent, and some armies behave badly, if we want to use that phrase, more in some situations than they do in others. And I think that's certainly true of the British Army when you look at what happened in Kenya. But I'll come back to that. But what you had was the British engage in a campaign against the communists to begin with. They tried to intimidate the Chinese rural population. And then when that fails, and it seems that the communists are actually getting stronger, what you have is a massive programme of resettlement as part of the so-called Briggs Plan being implemented. And this is not a small-scale affair. This involved the forced resettlement of something like 400,000 people. This is large-scale stuff where these people were rounded up, the men, women and children were rounded up and were carted off to fenced new villages under searchlights where they were heavily policed and where, to all intents and purposes, they had no civil rights. This was large-scale stuff. This was not minimum force, I would argue. This was a assault. It's actually been described as an assault on a whole community. And while it didn't involve massacre and it didn't involve the sort of brutality that you do get in some similar operations carried out in other contexts by other armies, nevertheless, I don't think one should underestimate how brutal this actually was. Alongside this, you also had a large number of Chinese and Indian labourers being what they called concentrated. They were forced, people working on estates and in the mines were forced into policed communities where they could be kept under control. And what all this was designed to do, of course, was to cut the communists off, the communist bands who were in the jungle, to cut them off from any support they might have. And there's no doubt this I would argue, under Briggs, broke the back of the insurgency, turned the tide, was the decisive strategic moment, if you like. This is before Field Marshal Templer arrives, who I suppose gets most of the credit. But in fact, really, I think the strategic victory had already been accomplished before Templer arrived. And you get the Chinese communists holding on, but really the tide has been turned against them by this resettlement. One thing, of course, is that, which I can't resist going into, although I don't think it's important, but we also bombed the shit out of the forests. We dropped, I've got the figures here, let me find them, we dropped 30,000 tons of bombs on the forests. And one policeman said it was like bombing the sea in the hope of hitting a passing submarine. They claim to have killed 700 guerrillas through bombing. I think this is wildly exaggerated. They had to have some decent sounding figure. But even then it works out at, what's 30,000 tons divided by 700? It's something like 40 tons per guerrilla. That's right, 40 tons of bombs to kill one guerrilla. And this is even given what are almost certainly their exaggerated figures. My own view is that it was to maintain morale, partly, but I also suspect it was to give the RAF something to do. But the cost, it just defies belief, really. There is a bloke called Andrew Mumford has looked at this, and one of the points he makes is that there is a tendency for politicians in particular to grasp bombing as a sort of strategic comfort blanket. Doesn't use the word comfort blanket, but that's more or less what he means. And that you know, if you don't know what to do, let's bomb it. And this is certainly, you know, the bit of problem in the jungle. Well, let's bomb the jungle. We might hit some of them. And this certainly, I think, is a factor there. And I suspect this is still a factor today, even with you know, smart military technology. This is still a factor that you don't know what to do, so let's bomb them, you know, and see if that does any good. Or at least it appears to look as if it might be doing some good, perhaps. You did have excesses. The most famous is the Batancali massacre, when 24 Chinese labourers were killed. There were other episodes, but to be fair, these are small-scale excesses compared to what the French did, to what the Americans did, and to what the Russians did in their various wars. And my own view is that there are a number of factors involved here, but certainly one of them is the low level of the fighting, and the low level of this, you know, that it was a small war and there were a low level of British casualties. I think this very much was a factor in there being comparatively minor British excesses. There's a lot of brutality. You have young men dealing with people they can't understand who are hostile. You know, I mean, I never joined the army, but I was going to join up as a boy soldier when I was 15, and I've no doubt in my mind that if I'd been sent to Aden, I'd have behaved just like the rest of the soldiers did when you're put into that situation and confronted with those circumstances. My dad, God bless him, refused to sign the papers on the grounds that I was stupid. He'd been in the army, and he obviously thought I had no idea what I was letting myself in for. But we never spoke for 6 months, but he was dead right. But this is, you know, this was a success, but it was a success, I would argue, predicated very much on specific circumstances, and as much force as was necessary was used, and there were excesses, but the excesses were at a small scale because so was the war. Now, when you turn to Kenya, what you find is that another factor comes into the equation as far as military excesses are concerned. But when you turn to Kenya, what you have is a insurgency that you know, is a product of discontent among a number of African groups, the Kikuyu, the Embu, and the Meru in particular. You have an underground organisation being established that originally looks for reform, and when that door seems to be closed off, turns to insurrection. They are very poorly armed. They had hardly any precision weapons whatsoever, and they find themselves, you know, at war with the British. The British launch the preemptive roundup of suspects, including the moderate leadership of the African nationalist movement, Kenyatta, for example, but they also round up a number of the revolutionary leaders. And you have, once again, you have a war break out, although on this occasion, like I say, the rebels were very, very poorly armed indeed. One British unit, the Buffs, I think during their tours in Kenya, killed something like 280 Mau Mau, as they were called, but among the weapons they only captured one precision firearm. And what this shows really is that the Mau Mau were, you know, to all intents and purposes, armed with swords and spears, and they made their own guns, which apparently were as dangerous towards them as they were to whoever they were aiming at. What you have, though, on this occasion is the rebellion is put down with a degree of ferocity that I would argue, given the scale of the conflict, is every bit as fierce and savage as the way the French conducted themselves in Algeria and, you know, the other colonial wars. And this was because it was not just a insurgency against colonial rule, it was also an insurgency against a white settler community, so that it was an insurgency against white supremacy. And I would argue that the scale of the bloodletting that is carried out by the security forces, particularly by the police, but not just by the police, and this was very much predicated on the fact that they were killing black people in the attempt to maintain white supremacy. And there are, you know, absolutely credible accounts of the most fearful atrocities being committed, prisoners being burned alive, prisoners being tortured quite horribly. You know, the scale of the repression was something absolutely shameful. When you think this happened in the 1950s, and you had, you know, the prime ministers at the time were Winston Churchill, Anthony Eden, and Harold Macmillan, and they're presiding over this sort of violence. It really is quite shocking. On one occasion, Churchill refused to have they hanged people for a whole range of offences, and they wanted to include being in possession of incendiary materials as a capital offence, and Churchill refused to sign it on the grounds that they would be hanging people for having a box of matches. And one suspects that he was not exaggerating, you know, that this was the case. In the course of the Mau Mau insurgency, they hanged 1,090 Mau Mau. The Daily Telegraph correspondent described many of the trials as a disgrace to British justice. Over 400 people were hanged for the administering of illegal oaths. Over 400. You'll find quite a lot of the accounts describe these oaths as indescribably obscene. Although, to be fair, Frank Kitson says that it was no more than what went on in the average English public school. You know, given the recent pig-nobbing sort of rumours, I won't go any further than that, one can see what he meant. But Kitson took a very didn't take that particular thing that seriously at all. You were hanged, large numbers of people were being hanged in possession of a firearm, being hanged in possession of ammunition, and even Kimati, when he's finally captured, the last leader at large, he's hanged for being in possession of a pistol and two bullets. So this is a judicial massacre, I would argue, of some moment. There is a tremendous book that deals with it, The Histories of the Hanged, by David Anderson, which is, I think, one of the best history books that I've read in my career, I would say. Actually, we never mentioned David Caesarani, did we?
No, we didn't.
Which, yeah, it was Justice Delayed is another one of my books that I think is a tremendous book. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. You know, this was a massacre of some moment, and I don't think, in terms of British history, I think you've got to go back to the suppression of the Indian Rebellion in the 1850s to find something on a similar scale. The back of the rebel movement is broken when Nairobi is cleared, Operation Anvil. Thousands of troops are put into Nairobi, and they screen the African population. And the city really is cleared of those tribal groups that are seen to be part of the rebellion. It has been argued that the police actually had quotas they had to fulfill. One account makes absolutely clear that they were going around trying to free some of the moderate trade union leaders who had been rounded up. Labour officials were going around, and they were told everyone with a union card was automatically interned. You know, this was the scale of the thing, and they interned over 20,000 people. Large numbers were deported from the city, and what I suppose gives it another dimension is when you know that when you were rounded up, you weren't allowed to go home and get your belongings. Everything you had that you didn't have on you, you lost, because you were just taken away there and then. So if you had I don't know, anything, you lost it, and in fact it fell into the hands of the police and the Home Guard. They looted the possessions of the people who were interned. At the height of the emergency, there were 77,000 people interned. That's not the number that were interned, that's the most that were interned on one particular day, and that didn't include people who were only interned, I'm not sure whether it was for a fortnight or 3 weeks. Conditions in the camps were pretty appalling. One British police officer privately told Barbara Castle that he'd been interned by the Japanese during the Second World War, and conditions in the camps in Kenya were worse than he'd experienced at the hands of the Japanese. You have to be careful about these sorts of comparisons, but nevertheless, this does give an idea of how bad conditions were. Torture was used in a very widespread way. And there are plenty of anecdotal accounts where people quite cheerfully admit to murder and torture. One American who was serving with the Kenyan police reserve beat a woman suspect to death with a rifle butt and was told by another policeman watching that he'd make a wonderful cricketer, for example. You know, that these sort of anecdotes were freely available long before it was actually accepted that the violence being carried out in Kenya was on this sort of scale. There were plenty of anecdotal accounts bearing this out. But of course, as I'm sure people know, the Hanslope archive, which is still being looked at, has revealed that a lot of this was actually documented at the time and covered up. And there is what must be one of the most remarkable legal letters from the Kenyan Attorney General actually advising what parts of the body prisoners could be beaten on without leaving marks, and ending with the remark that if we're going to sin, we must sin quietly. This was a remarkable level of violence that was directed against these people. General Erskine, the British commander there, as I'm sure some people know, had no time for the settlers, who he regarded as a very shady crowd, not reputable people at all. But you know, he more or less gave up trying to impose discipline. He did issue an order that you mustn't beat the inhabitants of this country up just because they are in the inhabitants. This was the actual phrase he used, but he seems to have given up, you know, trying to bring the sort of order that he wanted to bring. But the movement was destroyed. The movement was broken. What you also get, though, of course, is, you know, not just the level of repression being a factor here, and not just the level of repression in Malaya either. What you also have, and in some ways this becomes a clearer factor when you look at the situations when the British actually suffered defeats. The success didn't just rest on the mobilisation of force by the security forces. What it also required was the building of a political alliance, if you like. Now, I would argue this isn't hearts and minds. What it is the more old-fashioned term is divide and rule. And what hearts and minds is really an attempt to adapt the concept of divide and rule for the age of the welfare state, to make it seem kinder. You know, but there's no doubt, you know, that one of the reasons for the British success was actually a political success, in that they did manage to construct a degree of political support among some sections of the colonial population that provided a base from which they could, you know, use violence against the insurgents and the sections of the community that supported the insurgents. And someone like John Cross, who was a soldier in Malaya and was, you know, one of the acknowledged experts on jungle warfare, actually argued himself that it wasn't the sort of techniques that he developed and others developed for fighting jungle warfare that were decisive. What was decisive was that the British managed to build a bigger base of support in Malaya and he makes the point explicitly, and the French had been able to do in Indochina, or the Americans had been able to do in Vietnam. So this political dimension is also important when it comes to winning these conflicts. And when where the British lose, I would argue that the decisive factor actually is the failure to build that sort of political base from which you can operate out of militarily, if you can follow what I'm getting at. I want to say a little bit about Northern Ireland. pardon me, it's not the same as the other insurgencies, the conflicts that were fought in South Arabia, the conflicts that were fought in Cyprus and in Oman and Darfur. It's not the same, but nevertheless, what I would argue is that when in the initial stages of the conflict, you had the army being put into a situation where their solution was to use the methods that they had developed in these earlier conflicts. And I think it's fair to say that now, even among the military, there is an agreement that those methods made the situation worse. Using those methods in a European urban environment proved absolutely disastrous. And you have a whole succession of episodes that made the situation worse. You get someone like Gerry Adams telling Tony Blair that Bloody Sunday, for example, was the making of the IRA. This was a decisive event in terms of consolidating support behind the IRA and allowing them to carry on a protracted struggle. There seems little doubt that when you look at the whole catalogue of episodes, some that are well known, but also day-to-day things that are happening on the streets, for example, that this without any doubt contributed to build up support for the IRA. What I would argue myself is that what the British Army found themselves was that they did have a strong base of support in Northern Ireland. They had the Protestant community. This was the majority community, which was strongly in support of the British Army. The problem they had was that in the context of the time, they could not use the degree of force against the minority that could have won the war. I don't think the war, you can defeat urban guerrillas if you're brutal and murderous enough. You've only got to look at the defeat of the insurgents in Argentina, for example. If you're brutal enough, these people can be isolated and can be destroyed. The problem in Northern Ireland was that the methods that might have worked weren't possible in the context of Britain in the 1970s. And what they ended up with was methods that were brutal enough to alienate the Catholic community, but not brutal enough to effectively intimidate them. I think this was the situation they found themselves in. The troops did alienate the Catholic community, but they didn't actually cow them. When you see film, for example, of crowds trying to wrest rifles out of the hands of British troops, this didn't happen in Argentina. Because the Argentinian military would have killed large numbers of people, and the people would have learned the lesson. You don't do that to the security forces in that context. In Britain, the troops did enough to really piss people off, but they were not in a position to behave with a level of violence that would actually effectively intimidate the people for a whole number of reasons. Both the fact that it was happening in part of the United Kingdom, but also relations with the Irish Republic and relations with the United States and whatever. The Northern Irish government actually asked Templar to give them his advice. They'd been successful, he'd been successful as far as they could see in Malaya. What could he advise in terms of dealing with the situation in Northern Ireland? And Templar actually said the methods we used in Malaya you couldn't possibly use in Northern Ireland. It's just not something that would be acceptable to use them in that context. And I think this is quite telling myself. And what you get, in fact, I would argue, is that the counter-insurgency methods of colonial warfare are in fact abandoned in Northern Ireland. And you get a turn to what I've described as an internal security approach, which I think this is still something. There's still a lot of research going into this, but this leaned more on the European experience against various organisations like the Red Brigade than it did on the British counterinsurgency experience, I would argue. It relied more on the police with the army, except in the border regions, and in particular in South Armagh, the army coming to play more and more of a secondary role, and specialist units and the RUC becoming the the sort of force that actually went after the provisional IRA. And what you get, of course, is that it doesn't end in a British victory. I mean, it is a victory of sorts in the sense that the provisionals came to terms without any fundamental British interests being affected. But nevertheless, in terms of the struggle in Northern Ireland, I think it has to be seen as a draw. I know this sounds rather crude to say you have a win, a lose and a draw. It's more like the football pools perhaps, but certainly in Northern Ireland, the Protestants suffered a defeat, and the Catholic community had a victory, even if it wasn't the Republic. But the British were able to preside over this, I'm not convinced it's going to hold. I don't know if people followed it, but before the last general election, there are secret meetings between the Unionists and the Conservatives about what concessions the Unionists would get if there was a hung Parliament, which is so irresponsible when you think of it's like the people running the country have no memory at all of what's gone before, but they aren't in that position. But certainly there were all sorts of conversations going on. But this from that point of view, Northern Ireland is a bit different. I would argue the experience is different. There was a retreat from counterinsurgency there. Now, when we turn to Iraq and Afghanistan, what we have there is a situation where, like I said before, the British surrendered their strategic judgment to the United States. Unfortunately for them, they surrendered it to a president who was little better than an idiot, and a number of people who were not idiots. I wouldn't say Rumsfeld and Cheney were idiots by any stretch of the imagination. These were hard-nosed, clever men, but nevertheless they had completely lost, I would say, any sense of balance because of the collapse of communism and the belief that America was so powerful, America could do what it wanted. When you read Cheney's account of why they didn't invade Iraq in the first Gulf War, everything he says applies to not invading in the second Iraq war. He says it'll be a quagmire. We'll find ourselves stuck in a war between the Shias, the Sunnis and the Kurds. That's exactly what happened when they did invade. Everything that he warned against, that he gave as a reason for not going after Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War, this is something that was proven to be absolutely right when they did actually invade Afghanistan. So this was not a Wally, this was not someone who was an idiot, this was someone who became so convinced that American power was irresistible and they could reshape the world how they wanted, that they go into Iraq, we go in with them, and as I'm sure people know, the occupation is a total disaster. Some people have actually argued that you got the impression that with the things they did, it was almost as if they were trying to encourage a full-scale insurgency. The American military is not. They don't have enough troops there to cope with the insurgency, and their already predisposition to the excessive use of firepower is actually exaggerated by the fact that there aren't enough troops anyway. So the situation gets worse and worse. Now, as far as the British are concerned, what's interesting is you get a whole number of British officers at the time looking down their noses at the Americans for getting it all wrong. We know how to do this sort of war. Look at the Americans cocking it all up. We took responsibility for the South. The Americans are cocking everything up, silly sods. They got the slightest idea what they're doing. And a number of Americans, including the likes of Petraeus and John Naig, were convinced by this. That the British know how to do it, and just as they're convinced by this argument, and they're looking at Malaya in particular as a model, everything is collapsing in the south, where for different reasons the British found themselves really in the shit. I think is not too strong a word to use, and of course once this gets through to the Americans, that the British have not been successful at all in the South, then you do get what one American account describes how a British general who, the phrase he used, if he'd been the best in class, we'd have had to put up with it. But he was the worst in class, and we just sat there rolling our eyes while this general is lecturing them on how to conduct counterinsurgency when the British troops are really up against it in Basra and elsewhere. The reason is, I don't think the reason is anything to do with whether the British Army was good at counterinsurgency or not, myself. Although the failures in Iraq and Afghanistan have undermined that idea that the British Army had some sort of special expertise. I don't actually think that what went on in Iraq and Afghanistan demonstrates that. The problem you had was you had a government that wanted to support the United States for all sorts of reasons, but certainly didn't want to put the resources in to actually make it to actually give, the troops were not given the resources that would have allowed them to accomplish the tasks that they were volunteered for. And this, I think, is borne out in much of the literature. I would like to think I argue it quite convincingly in the book. And continually the government was pulling troops out right the way through at the same time as the situation was getting worse. That the war was unpopular. And the government was just keen to get out. To be fair, the British Army had been configured to fight alongside the Americans. What they thought was expeditionary forces that would go in and then pull out. They never actually thought in terms of being there for an extended period. That's not what the British Army was equipped to do. But nevertheless, once they found themselves there, really the troops, I would argue, were left high and dry militarily. And where the government was successful was in its news management. They're very successful in terms of their news management because public opinion in Britain had no idea how severe the fighting was. One British general, Dannett, asked his son what it was like in one of the towns he'd fought in, and he said, "Have you seen Black Hawk Down, Dad? It's like that." And this is severe fighting. This is not it was never presented to the British public how serious the conflict was, or the scale of the setbacks, where in the end, you have a situation where, to all intents and purposes, the British are driven out of Basra, and when the Americans and the Iraqis actually go in to defeat the militias in Basra, you have someone like Anthony Cordsman, just quite casually saying that while we were doing this, the British were hiding out at the airport. The credibility of the British in American eyes, I would argue, suffered a very serious blow. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that while this is going on, the new Labour government volunteers to take over Helmand province in Afghanistan. I'm not sure why. Certainly they thought this would be a good war, whereas the Iraq war was a bad war. They thought perhaps they could get public opinion behind this. If you remember, there was no actual discussion of this as a war. In fact, if you remember, John Reed said that he chose his words carefully. He said he hoped or believed, I can't remember which, that the troops would not have to fire a shot while they were there. Blair says he briefed him very differently, but who's lying, or are they both lying? We don't know, but the situation in Afghanistan was one where the British troops go in. Once again, the numbers are completely inadequate to deal with the situation they are confronted with, and not only that, but a good case can be made, I think an overwhelming case can be made, that you actually had a situation where British troops are in Afghanistan supporting a narco state that had been installed in power really by the CIA, who have a certain track record in this regard. Having close relationships with drug dealers is not something that's new for the CIA. And you actually had a situation where British troops are fighting for a regime that, in any other circumstances, we would not have touched with a barge pole. And I don't think this has actually got through. Karzai was the smiling face of what was in fact a gangster regime. Petraeus himself described it as a criminal syndicate, the Karzai regime. One UN researcher said it's a mafia state, and as mafia states go, these are her words, it's not a good one. As mafia states go, it's not a good one. And this is Another woman who was actually involved in trying to clean up the corruption there described it as a kleptocracy. This was a kleptocracy. Every post was sold. You became a policeman, you bought your job, you recouped the money by extortion and intimidation. This is not the way to win hearts and minds, you know. Apparently the most expensive jobs to buy were in counter narcotics, for obvious reasons, and a senior job in the counter narcotics ministry could cost $200,000 a year because of the amount of backhanders that you could then get. And of course the minister in charge of counter narcotics was supposed to be a major drug trafficker himself, which the more you look at the regime, the less surprising this sort of thing becomes. But once again, you know, you had British troops put in a position where they were completely under-resourced. I don't think it's just the politicians. The generals volunteered them for tasks that they were under-resourced for. The British ambassador argued that the generals were fighting two wars at the time. One was against the Taliban, but the other one was against the real enemy, the Navy, over the size of budgets. And they needed, you know, the war was useful because it enabled them to defend their budget. I'm sure there's an element of that, but I'm not. You know, he's become increasingly disillusioned with the war. He describes in his memoirs how his report saying it's not going well were upsetting London, and a senior officer came to have a word with him, and he's having a shave while you know, just before meeting this senior officer, and suddenly there's a huge explosion that shakes the embassy, and his bodyguard runs in, and he's standing there naked, and the bodyguard puts a tin hat on his head and surrounds him in a bulletproof vest. And he said, it made my job of going down saying things are not going that well that much easier. you know, it made it that much easier. But this was all covered up. This was all covered up. And you actually have a situation towards the end where the British don't want to ask the Americans to take over in Helmand, because that's another humiliation. You actually have David Miliband ask the Americans to offer to take over without a formal request. And that's the way the situation is dealt with. But you know, there's no doubt the British military were put in an impossible position. It didn't demonstrate whether the British were any good at counterinsurgency or not, because the resources were never there to find out. I would argue they're not because of the previous historical experience. But the fact of the matter is that these were token activity. These were token expeditions as far as the British were concerned in what were real wars, and the consequences were quite dire. Anyway, just a couple of last remarks, really. And when you look at the way things are going, I would say the credibility of the British military has suffered considerable damage as far as the in American eyes. I don't think the Americans any longer regard us as a serious military asset, and I think this is especially true in view of the cuts that have been made to the British military under the coalition government, and which are still continuing under the present government. Britain is not regarded as a serious military asset by the Americans. I think the corollary of that, though, is that there is also a belief that the Americans are nowhere near as important as they used to be. The fact that the Americans can't control their allies in the Middle East, the Turkey, the Saudis, Israel, more or less do what they like, rather than actually do what the Americans want. And they certainly can't defeat their enemies. The failure of the United States to destroy ISIS, for example, that doesn't inspire confidence in American power. My own view is that the invitation to the Chinese leader to come to Britain is it's got strategic implications as well as economic implications. They're not just handing over British infrastructure in return for the City of London having a special relationship with Beijing. This also has strategic implications, and I think this is hypothetical, but I think it's inconceivable that 10 years ago George Osborne wouldn't have had to ask the Americans about this Chinese visit and its implications. Today he didn't. They just went ahead, and this is both because the Americans no longer are that bothered about what we do, but also American power, I think, is not saying it's in permanent decline. Very likely it isn't, but nevertheless it's in relative decline, certainly compared to China. Another factor which I haven't really discussed is, of course, the rise of private military companies. You have at its height in Iraq, there was something like perhaps as many as 48,000 armed private soldiers. No one knows really. The highest figure is about 48,000. Many of them were employed by British companies. This is an important development that really we haven't got our heads around. I myself think it's a threat to parliamentary democracy. I would put it as strongly as that, to have private military companies. What you've got, though, is far from the politicians of all parties being concerned with this expansion of private military power and any threat it might pose. Most of them are more concerned with joining the board of directors of these companies or working for them as consultants, rather than actually seeing them as any sort of threat. But this private military power is a new phenomenon. The actual privatisation of logistics, training, and this sort of thing is different from, that's important in itself, and some of the companies involved in that also are straightforward, have mercenary elements to their portfolio as well. But this is an important development. The last thing I'll say is in terms of military excess. There are the 3 Fs that I think can be seen as explaining soldiers committing atrocities, soldiers committing excesses. This is fear, fury, and what was the other one? Fear, fury, and frustration. And I think all soldiers in all armies find themselves in circumstances where they will do things which they wouldn't have done by and large. I mean, you do get some people in every army, I'm sure, who are just bastards and would be bastards in any walk of life. But nevertheless, I think for most soldiers that they might well find themselves doing things because of fear, fury, and frustration. But that is mediated by other factors. It's mediated by military tradition, it's mediated by culture, it's mediated by issues of race. Who are you doing these things to? It's mediated by government and military policy. It might come as a surprise, but when the Wehrmacht went into Russia, there were continued complaints that the troops weren't being brutal enough, and they had to toughen up because they had to recognise they had to kill women and children, and this was something that a lot of the soldiers were very reluctant to do. So you had a situation there where the military and governmental authorities were actually urging the committing of atrocities and excesses. The other factor, of course, is the seriousness of the fighting. If the military and the police are suffering very heavy casualties, then the likelihood of the troops responding to this is increased. Kenya is the exception because the troops and the police suffered very low casualties, and that, I would argue that it's very much racism that is responsible for the atrocities committed there. But there's an interesting area there, the sort of sociology of military excess, to actually look at the various factors that are involved in this. All armies do it, but not all armies do it to the same extent, and not all armies do it in every circumstance. And this is something that is quite an interesting interesting subject. But that's it.
Okay, thanks very much, Jim.